Welcome to our discussion of memory, where we'll talk about what it is, how does it work, and how can we get it to work better. This and more coming up. It's important to remember that when we talk about memory, we have to also understand the organ that is responsible for processing and retrieving these memories, the brain. How does the brain deal with all of the information that it has to deal with at any given time? As we'll find out, this leads to a process, a step-by-step process in which the brain deals with this flood of all sensory information coming into our system, narrows it down, and then picks a few things that it is likely to store long term. Also, we'll talk about different memory types. We'll break memory down into many different subcategories and talk about why it's important to do so. We'll talk about what does forgetting mean? How is it different from maybe our layperson definition of forgetting? And of course, we'll talk about memory tips as well in terms of how can we get our memory to work for us better. But first, here's a memory test. Let's take 10, 15 seconds to try and remember as many of these things as you can. And time. We will come back to this at some point in the slideshow. But first, let's do some true and false to see where we're starting off. If you're wondering when a good time to remember a list of things that you want to do the next day, the hour before sleep is actually a very good time to try and do that. The idea is that, sort of due to the availability effect, this is the stuff that we're exposing our memory system to right before we sleep, and we know that sleep is an important component for memory consolidation, and maybe we'll be likely to dream about some of these things, further increasing the likelihood that the information we put into our memory system before bed is likely to last in a long-term fashion. This is certainly false. You may have many things that you wonder, why do you remember this now? For me, it's song lyrics from songs from the 80s or shows that I may have watched 10 or 20 times, and I can remember exact dialogue. And I never really wanted to remember that. That was not my goal, but it got in the memory system anyway, and it stuck with me for years and years. This one is a bit tricky. It's important that we don't just consider our memory in terms of trying to recall something off the top of our head and then making a judgment about whether we've memorized it well. What we find is that how our memory works best is when we use the cues that we associate with those memories to suggest or to get us going toward that memory that we're really trying to get to. And here the idea is that, true, when you learn something when you're intoxicated or depressed or happy, you are more likely to recall that memory when you are in that same state. Of course, this isn't the best scenario for ultimate learning. What we really want is to learn something when we're clear-headed and then have a situation to recall that memory when we're also clear-headed. But of course, sometimes we don't have control over the situations we're in when we learn something, and it might be important to try and match that situation to bring that memory back later on. There's a lot of belief that childhood memories are repressed. It's important to distinguish between the first 3 years of life where the hippocampus hasn't been fully developed and that explicit pathway for memories of things you've experienced, situations you've been in, hasn't really developed. After age 3, though, the hippocampus seems to be working much like it does in adulthood, and children, for example, witnessing trauma aren't any more likely to repress it or suppress or not be able to remember that memory as anything else. And in fact, if you experience trauma, what we'll find out is that it's more likely to intrude and come to the memory system at times where you don't want it to. This is interesting if we think about the billions of neurons we have and the many more billions of connections between them. As far as we know, there is no actual limit into the number of things that we can remember. And we'll find some interesting examples that show us that some people, for example, basically remember every situation or every episode of their lives and can recall in precise detail 50 years later what was happening on a certain day with no real reason to try and remember that thing, but it's just that their memory system is different, illustrating that, as far as we know, there's no limit to the number of things that we can remember. There's also a belief that there are ways to get at forgotten events, certain tricks like hypnosis being one of them, and typically that's false. Unless you were under hypnosis when you learned it, chances are hypnosis is not going to be helpful for dragging out a memory that there's no other way to get to. Going back to the idea from the true-false about repressing traumatic memories, there's been a large cottage industry in psychology, sort of on the fringes of psychology, because as you can see, this hasn't been supported by research. And of course, we have some people who are trying to profit off of this common belief. And I would argue that if you are a psychologist, you should have some data to make statements like this. And of course, if you don't, then you might have problems such as having to make settlements based on these false claims. So once again, actually, there's no idea that repressed memories happen, that we've experienced trauma and then later on completely forget about it or have blocked it. In fact, the problem is oftentimes a psychologist or other therapists might be trying to look for a repressed memory and might be actually creating a false memory, which means that the person has no memory of the event because it almost certainly did not happen. But now, through this belief and interaction with a therapist, especially a trusted therapist, now they might believe that this thing actually happened to them, which also goes to the notion that we have some sort of suggestibility to our memories. Some things we remember and we can picture exact details. Other times, in fact more often, we are thinking that we're retrieving a memory, but in reality, we're making some of it up. We're taking some of the things that we do remember and filling in the blanks, and it's hard for us to tell which really happened and which were the ones that we're adding. So we'll talk about this phenomenon as well later on. If you remember, what kinds of images did you see from our memory test? Some of these images were on the initial test. Some have been changed. Maybe you've been able to identify that I've simply changed this middle column, and the left and the right columns are identical from the initial memory test. Now think about what kind of strategies you used. For example, did you try to go from left to right and just remember the order? Or for example, did you try to tell a story? So for example, in the initial one, you could imagine a picnic that you rode your bike to and you unpacked the lunch, and then there was lemonade and chicken and an apple, and then you saw a puppy there. What we find out, and as we'll talk about later, if you can connect or chunk these individual pieces of information within a larger story, we're likely to remember more total things. So that's one strategy you could use for future memory tests. And we'll find out that many memory champions, in fact, use the same basic strategy, except with a lot of practice and with a lot of attention to detail that we might not see. You have to do some preparation in terms of how you're going to organize things. And then it might look like you can remember the exact location of 500 randomly shuffled cards in a deck, for example. But let's start from the basic definition of memory. It's the persistence over time of learning, which makes sense. If we remembered something, we have to show that we know it after we've learned it previously. And also our definition includes the process. We have to get it in the memory system, we have to keep it there, and then we have to be able to retrieve or bring it out of the memory system. So one way to get started talking about our different kinds of memory is that of a flashbulb memory. Something where it seemed like we're witnessing an important event in our lives, whether it's, for example, 9/11 is a common flashbulb memory. Maybe falling in love could be a flashbulb memory, or things that are personally relevant are likely to be flashbulb memories. And it seems like in those moments, our memories just felt like a video recorder turning on, and we've got very detailed, both visual, but also other sensory, auditory, or tactile memories of that moment too. And think about how that works. For example, fear and anxiety can create a release of neurotransmitters and hormones, one cortisol, which is known to actually help memory in the short term. Of course, when we're in love, we might be under the influence of a different balance of hormones and such, and that can affect our memories too. And once again, if things are personally relevant, that means that it's easier to tie those things to other important things in our memories, so we've already got those linkages even before the event happens, if it's personally relevant. So if we want to create a flashbulb memory, it might be some kind of combination of these different factors. If you've seen the movie Bambi and you know how it ends, it's a little bit of a tragedy, what happens to Bambi's mother, but think about the perspective from the other forest animals. They might have flashbulb memories of this traumatic event and remember specific details about what they were doing and who they were with when that happened. Now consider this. Imagine somebody comes to you a year or two from now and says, I remember seeing you in this class, and this was your name, and here were some of the things you said, and you usually wore jeans and a hoodie. And then you would wonder, what is wrong with this person? Did they hire a private investigator to learn about me? So that kind of detail is not natural for memory. And for most purposes, it's good that we don't remember all these petty, basically not useful memories. Our memory system could hold all this information, but it just doesn't. Except for a select few people, as we'll talk about later, who seem to have perfect, what we'll call episodic memory, just showing us the potential power of episodic memories. Of course, you might ask, would you like to be able to have this ability? It might be good for example, answering Jeopardy questions, or finally proving that you were right in terms of arguing with your parents or your friends about what happened in that event in the past. But we also find out that people with this unique memory ability also have trade-offs, and that this is linked to things such as depression and even obsessive compulsive disorder. So let's talk about our first general breakdown of memory. First, we have episodic. These are events that have happened to you, sometimes called the stories of your life. And this is remember the time when, and then you can explain the story of that event. Contrast that with the other primary kind of explicit memory is semantic. This is often, as you see, the types of things we learn in classes. So for example, you understand how is the concept of memory similar to the concept of sensation and perception. And as we'll learn, well, if something never gets in the sensory system, we can never form a memory of it. So when you understand how something works or how something is similar to another thing, then you're getting into the idea of semantic memories. These are our schemas, our general ideas of what things are, but they also have sort of fuzzy boundaries that we're comfortable moving into and out of. So for example, how is addition similar to multiplication, but also different from? And those kind of questions illustrate how semantic memory works. Contrast that with implicit, non-declarative memory. These aren't the types of things where someone asks you to remember this. These are the types of things that you do. So behaviors that we practice a lot become implicit. And as you can see here, when we first start learning to play the piano, for example, it is a very explicit process. Okay, which finger should I use to play this note? And then as we practice over and over again, it just becomes automatic. Same thing for typing. When you first learn to type, it's very slow and there's lots of errors because not only are you trying to type the word, but you have to think, if I want to type this letter, which finger should I use to type that letter? And there's some good pop cultural examples of implicit memory. So for example, this is Malcolm Gladwell, a renowned writer of taking some hard psychology and putting some pop aspects and theory behind it. Writer for the New York Times, or the New Yorker magazine, I should say. And he was looking in one of his books called Outliers about what makes people become experts in their field. So for example, world-class musicians, world-class athletes, world-class business people. And what he came up with that is kind of stuck, it's not a perfect in terms of the science behind it, but it's a good way to get started, is the 10,000 hour rule. Meaning that to become world-class at some sort of skill, you've got to put in 10,000 hours of practice to make that skill so implicit that it becomes automatic. So for example, Gladwell talked about the Beatles, who played for 5 years in dive bars before becoming famous, and they'd have to play a lot because they weren't making much money. And through that practice and practice with each other, all this playing and interacting with each other and knowing what each other was going to do in certain situations helped them to open up and then pay more attention to the crowd while the music was still good. Another example is one of my favorites, Neil Morse, and his story is interesting because growing up, he used to play with his brothers in a garage, and they would play classic rock tunes, and then after each verse, maybe they would switch. So if you're playing the keyboard, then you move to guitar, then you move to drum. And of course, I imagine it sounded terrible when he was growing up, but with that practice, that skill became implicit, and so he can easily switch from guitar to keyboard to drum while singing, while leading the band, and it's all because he put in the practice that made all those skills implicit in that moment. Another example, I appreciate you hanging with me, would be Andre Agassi, if you've heard of him, the famous tennis player. Growing up, his dad forced him to locked him in hot Las Vegas tennis courts and forced him to hit balls over and over again when he would probably rather have been playing, hanging out with friends. And maybe he didn't like his father for it, but through all that practice, Andre Agassi grew later on to develop what most people recognize as maybe the best hand-eye coordination in the sport of tennis. And so when you're learning to change something from explicit to implicit, it's best if it happens sort of in late childhood, in that age range where we're really able to pick up on things quickly. But of course, most children can't spend 3 to 5 hours a day hitting tennis balls or playing an instrument. Another example would be sight reading. If you're not familiar with piano and you're just learning, we'd have two explicit memory components. You have to explicitly be trying to figure out which finger plays which note, and you'd have to be explicitly thinking about, since you haven't heard this song before, you're sight reading it, what is this supposed to sound like? What's the tempo? Is it correct? Of course, if somebody is a skilled pianist, they can sight read, and the implicit part is actually playing, seeing note, play note. The explicit part would be sort of looking ahead and trying to figure out where the song is going, since you've never heard that song before. Let's talk a bit about the memory process. We have the analogy as similar to a computer. So if you're working on a written assignment, for example, you have to write up what you want to say. And of course, once you're done writing, you don't just shut the computer off and walk away. You have to save that file. And then later on, you have to bring up that file. So one way our memory works better is if, for example, I don't know about you, sometimes I have 50 files on my desktop and I'm trying to find which file I'm looking for, and it's hard because it's not organized. So if you do some work ahead of time, so before you're trying to remember something, find ways to sort of pre-organize where to put things, or the computer example, use folders on your desktop, it makes it more easy and quick to retrieve that memory. So our first step in the process is encoding. The memory has to get into the system. And of course, we have a classic couple scenario where one person, oftentimes the woman, is trying to tell the man an important story, and after that story goes on for a while, he's forgotten some key details. But of course, was he forgetting them, or did he not even pay attention for them to get in the system? So it's possible that when we've think we've forgotten something, maybe we've never encoded it. It just never got further enough into the memory system to stick. There's also the issue of storage. Some storage for some kinds of memory can be a matter of seconds. Others can be for the rest of our lives. And of course, then the issue we want is retrieval. How do we get the information out of memory? Storage, going back a bit, how do we get long-term memory, such as things that we're learning in school that we want to know for test time? How do we get them into storage? Well, one way is just to try and get them into the memory system as many times as possible. This is why distributed studying, so learning it in class, learning it from your book, learning it maybe from thinking about it here and then, is more likely to lead to long-term storage than simply a long cramming session before the exam. Of course, the retrieval is also important in terms of how is the retrieval context similar to or different from the situation in which you learned it. So of course, if this guy learned his class material in his room with music on, with the TV on, while he was also texting, that's a lot different environment from the test-taking scenario, and it's likely to cause him to underperform relative to what he actually knows. Let's break down memory into different kinds in terms of the step-by-step process. So first of all, we have sensory memory, and we have to have an initial recording of sensory information, even though if you're walking down the street and I stop you randomly and say, okay, you just walked by that person, describe that person who just walked past. Well, chances are you weren't even really paying attention to that person, but you did have a brief split-second sensory memory because you didn't run into each other. And so for us to be able to navigate, we have to have a short sensory memory, even though we won't remember that 10 seconds later. We also have the next step, which is short-term memory. So once you've paid attention to something, so if that person had a weird hat, for example, that you did pay attention to, maybe that information then is in your short-term memory for a while, and then when I ask you this question, you can say, well, that person had a strange hat. The key is, you can only hold so many things in your short-term memory, and the more new things you put in, the more likely the old things are going to get bumped out. And of course, related to driving, you have a lot of stuff to pay attention to when you're driving, such as how fast you're going, the traffic around you, and if you're also paying attention to the phone, the food, and your drink at the same time, and the radio, perhaps you're really taking away your short-term memory and filling it with the less important stuff for the task of driving, leaving less short-term memory available to pay attention to the stuff that's really important to drive safely. And then, of course, stuff has to go from sensory memory. Most of it's dropped, but some of it gets to short-term memory. And just a few things that end up in short-term memory get transferred to long-term memory. But the good thing is that once it's there, it tends to stay there. So, for example, I can remember some of my BGSU IDs, and it was probably 10 years between when I used them as an undergrad versus when I used them as a faculty member. But once I had that start, they said, well, your ID should probably start with a 00, and then I was able to finish it off. So not only did I not need to practice it, I couldn't come up with it just by myself, but once I was given that cue, that start for what my password should be, then that served enough to track that memory and retrieve it. When we put all these things together, we can see the model working as one. So of course something happens. If it's within our sensory ability, the pitch is not too high or too low, for example, for us to hear. We hear it, we see it, and we see a little difference. So for visual memory, it's a quick half second. After that, it's gone. For auditory sensory memory, it lasts a little bit longer. So for example, if we are playing a song and then randomly stop that song, what you see in terms of people's brain waves is that their brain is still extending that guitar solo or that melody up to a few seconds after the physical stimulus has stopped. Once we pay attention to it, then it's entered our short-term memory, and then we can hold it in normal situations up to about 30 seconds, and we have a limited capacity of 7 plus or minus 2 or 5 to 9 chunks or things. And it's important to remember that a short-term memory is not just a one-way pathway to long-term memory. It is in that moment we're bringing things from our sensory memory and also integrating those things from our long-term memory. And so our general attention or consciousness is our short-term memory. And if we didn't have a short-term memory, it would mean it'd be very difficult to link things from our sensory memory and our long-term memory. So for example, you've taken a psychology class before, now your short-term memory is gone, so you can look at an exam, but you can't read the question and at the same time access that information. Fortunately, it's very rare for people to lose their short-term memory. Let's talk about some ways that encoding or getting stuff into the memory system can happen. First of all, we have automatic processing. Typically, anytime we see a written word, we want to read it. It's hard for us not to do that automatically. We can also be taught, for example, to read backwards. If we were handed a book with words reading right to left, at first it would be pretty difficult to read that first sentence or two. But if we kept practicing for an hour or so, we would get much more quick at it. Also, flashbulb memories would fall under automatic processing. It was information that went into the memory system without us having to try. What we really remember, though, are the times we've used effortful processing, trying to remember a name, for example, or trying to remember stuff for class. And here you can see there are two general types of effortful processing. One would be this idea of maintenance processing. So, for example, this is the definition for this word, or 2 plus 2 equals 4, 3 plus 3 equals 6, 4 plus 4 equals 8, and so on. And as you can see, it's a very simple type of memory. It doesn't really help us in terms of understanding more semantically about the rules undergirding this type of thing. So for example, you can get a young kid to remember the simple 2 plus 2 equals 4, 3 plus 3 equals 6. Then if you ask them something that they haven't recited a million times, 2 plus 3 equals, well, it's because they don't understand semantically what those numbers really represent. They just remember the rote or maintenance processing. So what we really want in most situations is elaborative processing. So how can you encode things semantically or elaboratively? Essay questions, where there's no one exact right answer, is a good way to think about this. Another way would be if you do review cards or flashcards. So on one side you have the definition, the other side you have the term. Just randomly shuffle them, pull some out, and then try to tell a story that links them together. And that way you'd be forced to use elaborative processing. It's important to remember we have different kinds of encoding. As we talked about, semantic encoding typically leads to the most stuff getting through into the memory system. So for example, semantically encoding would be if you see the word dog, you can picture a dog in your mind. Another example would be, who is this person? Can you tell me some things about this person? And if you have any semantic understanding of George W. Bush, you would say President, Republican, President during 9/11, things such as that. You can also have acoustic encoding. So for example, you hear the word dog, and then after that stimulus is gone, you can still hear that sound echoing a bit in your head. Also, we can have visual encoding, as we talked about before. So for example, if you, for example, see an image of a dog, what do you draw? For example, a 2-year-old might have difficulty coming up with a dog that's different from what it sees. So the child will then just try and rely on that visual memory on what it saw and try to recreate exactly what it was. And of course, here we can see that some of these issues can come up in interpersonal relationships. So for example, men are much less likely to encode in terms of reading facial expressions, for example, and females are much more likely to integrate the content of what somebody's saying and also what that means in terms of the person's facial expressions. And imagine how difficult it would be to have a discussion or even a fight with somebody else if you were limited to just acoustic or just visual encoding. There are some different ways to be able to play around and show these different types of encoding. So for example, if someone was trying to remember a list of 20 words, you could give them some different instructions. One would be just try to remember the ones written in capitals. You could also try acoustically rhymes with, so time and dime, for example. But what leads to the best memory performance is, of course, if you have them encode it semantically, right? So if it's a tuna, but they think of a salmon, they're closer to actually getting that correct answer later on. Even though they may not have encoded that exact thing, they've gotten close enough. One strategy that seems to be very powerful into increasing your memory ability is chunking. It sounds like a bodily function, but it is actually combining a larger number of things into smaller number of things, but they have to be meaningful units. So for example, how can you organize these 16 letters or chunk them? Well, if you chunk them in fours, you get important days such as the War of 1812, World War II, and instead of 16 separate things, you're remembering 4 chunks or 4 dates. And you might even be able to remember a few more if we added on to this. Acronyms are, of course, a great way to chunk. So we have memorizing the Great Lakes. Text speak, for example, is a way to combine or shorten complex things into shorter, more memorable sentences. Portmanteau, so combining 2 names into one, Brangelina in this example. And chess has been used a lot in memory. So you take a novice chess player, someone who doesn't know what they're doing, and show them a board that's in play, and then take away the pieces and ask them to recreate that board. Then I'll also ask them, for example, show them a board that is just randomly placed pieces on the board, and then ask them to recreate that board. If it's just a novice chess player, their performance on those 2 tasks is likely to be about the same. Now swap out that person for somebody who's been playing a lot of chess for a good part of their life, and they will have much better performance recreating a game that is in play, that is just taken during play. And why is that? Because they don't see those pieces in isolation. They know exactly how the knights and the rooks are able to move, and then they can see the patterns and how individual pieces are linked to other pieces. If this piece must be here, then another piece must be here, for example. And that's what I think a lot of expertise in our business, in our education represents. It's being able to chunk many things through seeing patterns into a smaller number of things. And it looks like that person has a better memory, but it's just a different kind of memory. Instead of explicit, it's more implicit and using lots of chunking. Something we may not appreciate is that simply reading language represents a huge amount of chunking, and we've had to learn to automatically process these things in steps. So for example, when we first had our blocks as kids, we didn't realize when a letter was right side up or reversed, right? But we had to learn then which way do the letters go. Then we had to learn that letters go together in words, and that words have to go together in sentences, and sentences in paragraphs. And as you can imagine, this takes years and years to do. But the benefit is that through schooling and through our education, as adults, we read and we keep that crystallized automatic skill for the rest of our lives. Here's a common phenomenon. Imagine this might be in maybe a nursing home with many Alzheimer's patients, mid to late stages. You show them a puzzle and ask, have you ever done this puzzle before? They say, no, I've never seen it before. I don't think so. Well, can you try and do it? Okay. And then they, in a short amount of time, blast through that puzzle and put it together super quickly, surprisingly quickly. Well, what happened here? Well, this person has lost their explicit memory. So they've probably been doing this puzzle every day or so for the last year, but they don't remember that episodic. That pathway has been eaten away through the Alzheimer's, but they may still have this implicit pathway, showing that they might not be able to learn things explicitly, but that doesn't mean they're not able to learn or remember anything. It's just that you have to rely more on this repetition, doing it many times to make it an implicit memory. Going back to the try and remember a long list of words as best you can, you'll often find that people substitute one word for a very similar word. So it means they get the answer technically wrong, but also shows they do have some memory. And how do we explain this? This is due to semantic encoding. So maybe they say tree when a bush was actually what was on the initial list. And again, semantic encoding tends to have that better linkage to long-term storage, and it's easier to queue up that semantic memory. So if we can try and remember most things semantically, our memories would be better off for it. Now let's move into short-term memory. Basically, there are two limits to short-term memory. It is limited in how long it lasts, again, usually 30 seconds. And it's also limited on how much can get in there. And of course, the number of 7 things plus or minus 2 tends to be about normal. But just like with most of our memory examples, we do have outliers. So for example, there are some people with seemingly near perfect short-term memory, and not only that, near seamless encoding from short-term memory to long-term memory. So for example, people who have very, very high intelligence tend to also have very high short-term memory. So for example, I could read this person a list of randomized 50 states and ask them to repeat that list. Now, most normal people could not even come close to getting all 50 states correct, but people with very high intelligence often can get that almost perfectly, some actually perfectly, and then also maybe 6 months later ask that person that random list of states and they can still do it. Once again, it shows what the memory system is possible to do, but is abnormal for most people. So going back to the average Joes like you and me, if you walk into a room and then think to yourself, what did I walk in here to do? Well, that means that as you were walking into the room, you probably thought about a couple other things. What else are you going to do today? Oh, this seems like fun. Can't wait for this to do on the weekend. And those new thoughts have bumped out from your short-term memory the initial goal of what you had in mind when you started walking to the room. And of course, once again, if we keep putting new stuff in our short-term memory, there's a limit for maybe the stuff that we care more about in our short-term memory. And we're impeding the likelihood that it's going to get into long-term memory that day. We haven't talked much about the retrieval process yet, but there's one way to break it down. We have two different basic kinds of retrieval tasks. One would be recall. So for example, off the top of your head, what is this athlete's number? Who wrote, or what was Beethoven's Last Symphony, for example? And without any cues, can you generate that information from your memory? As you might imagine, it's pretty difficult to do. We can also have a different retrieval task, and that is recognition. Instead of off the top of your head, can you remember which items were on the list? Now I'm going to show you a new list, and you have to identify which items were or were not on that initial list. And as you can imagine, people generally perform much better baseline on recognition tasks because you're given the cues, the potential answers, than recall tasks. Now, I believe that these codes are switched because what we see is recall tasks tend to be much lower at any age range. But as we move through the lifespan, we see this gap widening. So as we age, our recognition can basically stay the same as it was when we are in our 20s. But our recall off the top of our head goes way down. So for example, if I wanted to learn more about my family history, I wouldn't want to just start bombing questions to my grandma or grandpa. That might be more of a recall task, and it might lead to frustration. For example, who were you living with in the 1950s? Who was my dad's great uncle? But instead, what you might want to do is make it more of a recognition task. Show them pictures to recall some of these memories, and they can recognize some of these people, which will cue other related memories. We also have a number of other retrieval effects that we might want to keep in mind. First of all, we have what's known as relearning. Even though we haven't done something for a long time, we want to get back up to where we were in terms of speaking a second language, playing a sport, whatever it might be. If it took you 6 years in school for me to play the saxophone, if I wanted to get back to that level, would it take me 6 years now? Well, actually, no. Relearning tells us that it would probably take maybe a third of the time or a quarter of the time to get back up to my previous playing ability. So even though it feels like after we stop doing something for a while that we're starting from square one, we still have a lot of that memory in us. We just need to start doing it again to bring those memories back. We also have what's known as state-dependent memory, meaning when we are in one state, we are more likely to remember things that we also experienced when we were in that state. So for example, you can think about a hangover, right? When you're partying that night, you're probably thinking about how great life is and how much fun this is and how I want to do this more often. And then of course, the next day, you're feeling sick, you're feeling ill, and you're thinking, why do I do this? I never want to do this again. We also have mood congruent memory, which is the related concept that we're more likely to recall experiences that match our current mood or that we learned when we were in that mood. What this means is that if you know someone who's now in love, they might be in sort of this euphoric state, and the memories that are going to be accessible to them are other times where life was wonderful, where there was so much to look forward to, where there was so much happiness. Contrast that with somebody who's depressed. They are much more likely to remember times in their lives where they failed, where they were sad, where things didn't look like there was hope in terms of living. And we can use this knowledge, for example, in a cognitive therapy technique. So a therapist could say to someone who's depressed, right now, your memory is not an accurate representation of your life because you're just more likely to remember those negative events. So what we can do is come up with some ways to boost your current emotional state, and then you'll have a more representative or more happy set of memories that you're thinking about as you go through your day. We also have some ties to biological support for how memory works. We've already talked a lot about neuroscience, so we're going to keep this very light. We can actually see changes in the synapse. So for example, we have this concept of long-term potentiation. This basically means that even after a relatively brief time, you can change the threshold in which neurons that represent that information can fire. Classic example would be an ad blitz. So for example, leading up to the Super Bowl and just after, you might see a commercial so many times that you think you don't like it. Same thing with a song, that you don't like it at first, but research shows us that we tend to like things that are similar to what we're already familiar with. And once we've gotten familiar with that thing, being exposed to it in the future actually causes our pathways that represent that information to fire faster. We recognize it sooner, and chances are we might start to like it due to long-term changes in our synapse that happened in a relatively short time. As we talked about before, cortisol, the stress hormone, is increased in times of stress. And for example, the birth of my child, it was a somewhat traumatic birth, and I can remember very specific details about the hospital and the people in the room. The problem is that cortisol really helps our memory in the short term. The problem is if we stay in that stressful situation for more than a few days, the cortisol really starts to have a negative effect on our memory. So once again, cortisol and stress is good in short term, but also dangerous for more than a day or two. We also want to talk about a few brain structures. For some reason, unbelievably, the book does not mention this, but the hippocampus is an essential structure. It's a pathway for getting information into explicit memory and bringing it out of the memory storage information in our temporal lobe back into our short-term memory or working memory to be able to use. We also, for example, to get something into short-term memory, it means we're paying attention to it, and the area that lights up when we're paying attention to things and concentrating on things is the prefrontal cortex. So that's also hugely important for us to get short-term memories in to that system and make it more likely that they get into long-term memory. We can break this down in terms of relating these memories to things that we've already covered. So for example, explicit, we break down into semantic and episodic memories. And then with our implicit, we have sort of skills or motor ability, being able to type, being able to talk and walk. And then we also have a lot of our implicit memory that happens through classical and operant conditioning effects that we've talked about recently. Let's talk a bit about memory impairment or problems with the memory system. Most of us are familiar with the term amnesia, and this is typically reserved for explicit memory, and even more specific, a loss of episodic memories. What happened to me 5 years ago, I used to know, and now I can't. Or for example, semantic memories. I used to know some people from my childhood, and now I'm having trouble remembering them. There are two different kinds of amnesia. One would be anterograde. You forget about things after the incident. And also retrograde. You forget about things before the incident. So for example, with brain trauma, you're likely to have a concussion. You're likely to have both short-term anterograde and retrograde amnesia. Of course, the further out that those spread, so if, for example, the football player doesn't remember the play in which he got the injury, but does remember suiting up that day, chances are that's a better outcome than even forgetting what you had for breakfast that morning. What's important, though, is that typically these tend to get better over time, although moving forward, we're much more likely to have problems with anterograde amnesia. And if a person has persistent anterograde amnesia, that means that it was probably not just one hit that it was a problem. It means there's a long-term problem with the memory system. This is the general idea of forgetting, and amnesia is just one component. One idea of forgetting is that information just never gets to long-term memory. Someone gives us their number or their name, and then we get distracted, and that information never gets to long-term memory. Of course, the other example that we're most familiar with is that long-term memory is there, but we just cannot retrieve it. And of course, technically that's not forgetting. It's still in the memory system. We just can't or don't have the right cues to be able to access that memory. And William James, one of the founders of psychology, famously said that we would be as bad off if we remembered everything as if we remembered nothing. And I think most of what we talked about today supports that. There's so much that we experience that we don't need to remember. And what's important is that we adaptively attune our system to be able to remember the stuff that's really important. There's a lot of weird stuff that happens in movies about brain injury and memory specifically. And most, for example, people believe that those with amnesia just have that isolated problem of memory. The problem is that if you have severe amnesia, there's probably head trauma elsewhere, and that's going to lead to also other deficits beyond memory. Another funny point is that sometimes in movies you'll see if someone has a head injury and they experience memory loss, sometimes the solution is just hit your head again, and that might reset your system and make it better. There's definitely no support for that view. The more head trauma you have, the more likely there's some sort of impairment on your memory. So what about the forgetting curve? How long before the information I learn in school is not nearly as accessible to me as it was come exam time or finals week? So what we see is that 3 years out tends to be where the baseline generally, although we see a little bit of a decline later on, tends to settle. And of course, with relearning, if we wanted to get back to here, it wouldn't take that long to be able to get back to our previous Spanish ability. But if we don't practice that skill, and we're just asked on the spot to try and speak Spanish, we're going to have trouble with that. We can also talk about different kinds of interference in terms of what seems like forgetting. And in this case, some information is accessible that's blocking the information that we really want to access. So we have proactive interference, or forward acting. The old stuff is moving forward and preventing us from remembering that new stuff. So my example here would be is if you're in a current relationship, but you call your significant other the name of your ex or someone from a previous relationship, or tell a story from a previous relationship that you think happened in your current one. That'd be the old information interfering with what you really want to remember, your current significant other's name. And then there's also retroactive interference. Here, new learning is working backwards in time to block the recall or retrieval of the old stuff. And this is in many ways how our short-term memory typically works. So for example, we learn something new, and then that bumps out what we just had in mind. So for example, I was just going to do something, and I completely forget what that was now. So we can see these concepts together. For example, assume you're learning 2 foreign languages at the same time, and you study French in the morning, Spanish in the afternoon, and then in the evening you have an exam. If we're dealing with proactive interference, you're trying to remember the Spanish that you studied this afternoon, but what's coming in your memory is the French from the morning. Of course, this can work the opposite way too. Study French in the morning, Spanish in the afternoon, but you have an evening French exam, and now this new information, Spanish, is interfering with the information you really want retroactively. It's maybe a little difficult the first time you see it, but I think going through it a few times, you'll get the hang of it come exam time. Once again, forgetting is just a series of the memory system losing information in most cases. So most of our sensory memories immediately forgotten. Some of that gets into short-term memory. Some of it's bumped out. Some of it, especially if you keep exposing yourself to that person's name that you're trying to remember, will eventually get into the long-term system. And then sometimes forgetting is not about stuff never getting in, but it's there, and you're just having trouble retrieving what is actually there. So forgetting seems like a simple thing, but it could be the result of any part of this chain of events. As we talked about early on in this slideshow, much of our memory has susceptibility to construction or actively making up things that surround those things we do know. And once again, we're not that clear once we've come up with our story of which we're constructing and which really happened. So for example, Elizabeth Loftus has spent much of her career focused on this idea of memory reconstruction. And this has a lot of implications for eyewitness testimony. So for example, everybody is shown an image, a video of an actual accident. What's manipulated though is some people are asked different intensity of verbs in this leading question. And what you see is that those who get a more aggressive verb actually construct extra things from that video that everybody had seen. They overstate the extent of the damage. They talk about pieces of car being thrown all about. And then you ask them how confident they are. They're typically as confident as the people who more accurately were given the less leading word. So again, it's not how confident somebody is in terms of how accurate their memory is going to be. Using Loftus's constructed memory paradigm, here we have a nice quantitative variable. Ask people to estimate how fast the one car was going when it contacted versus hit, bumped, collided, or smashed into the other car. And we can see that there's a nearly 10-mile-an-hour difference from the very simple non-threatening word to the very intense, smashed word, which goes to show that if you're thinking about the accuracy of eyewitnesses, it's not likely to be very helpful, and they're very susceptible to how the question is phrased, other cues in the courtroom. So much so that it seems to me that a lot of eyewitness testimony is not about what they say in that room, but instead is what they say in that room consistent with the initial reports that were taken right after. And if there are many differences, then the defense attorney can tear apart that person and say they're not credible because their story has changed so much due to, in part, to this idea of memory construction. So there's been a lot of different ways to try and show memory construction, and in some cases, false or implanted memories that Elizabeth Loftus has worked with. So making up things in which someone's been attacked by an animal, or being bullied, or witnessed demonic perception, getting fingers caught in a mousetrap, and many other things. And as you can see, not everybody, in fact, below the majority of people, will even show these false memories. And it takes a lot of work. You have to maybe build in this false memory within larger things that were true. So maybe doctor a picture in for example, a picture book, and there's all these other pictures that really happen, and then there's this one that they're trying to implant that's stuck in there. And even then, fewer than half of the people will later believe that that fake memory actually happened to them. And of course, memory is often a big feature in movies, but in fact, much of it is fiction. So for example, The Bourne Identity, Jason Bourne has no idea of anything about his past. Very, very uncommon. Total Recall, if you've seen that movie, the idea to implant very detailed memories of vacations and adventures may be possible in the future. I don't know how to explain that through neuroscience that we know, but certainly not the case now. Eternal Sunshine is a great movie, but also you can't just pay to have certain memories, such as of an ex, removed. Memory just doesn't work like that. We don't have that much control. If you want to see maybe the best example of maybe not perfectly accurate, but some of the challenges that somebody with severe amnesia might have and how they can use that in their lives, Memento might be a good place to start. So let's talk about how to improve our memory. Basically, we're going to combine some of the things that we've already talked about. Study repeatedly. So one-nighters, all-nighters just before the exam, especially if you've skipped all the work beforehand, not likely to work very well. Sometimes we can really help our memory, not just by plowing through and continually reading over stuff, but think about it when we're doing other things, taking walks, if we're, for example, on the highway and maybe don't have to pay as much attention to the road at that moment. And of course, if we can apply a concept to something that we've seen or experienced or someone we know, it's much more likely to stick. We also have some of the memory tricks that we've talked about. We want to do semantically based elaborative rehearsal instead of just repeating definitions. The more we can chunk, the better. And of course, many people who look like they have great memories, people who, for example, look like they can remember everybody in a meeting, typically what they do is, it's not that they have great memory, they just have efficient behaviors to try and get those memories in. Taking notes, try and learn those names immediately after the meeting. And it's about the behaviors, the strategies they use, rather than just naturally being gifted in terms of their memory. Of course, we can also try to match through state-dependent and mood-congruent memories the recall or retrieval context to the learning context. And of course, this is, for example, people who remember their dreams well. Typically, they don't have better memories, but they just think about their dreams more often, and they're more likely to write them down before something else in your maybe waking up routine interferes with the content of your dream. And then, of course, some of our behaviors that we should be doing otherwise will also benefit our memory, such as sleeping and making sure we don't cut off the last couple hours of sleep where we're most likely to experience dreaming and the benefits of memory consolidation. This might have happened to you. You know which page, and you can picture the page where the answer is, but you can't actually come up with the answer. You have actually visually encoded that information, and you weren't trying to do that. You wanted to learn it semantically, but it went in automatically visually. Hopefully, we have a good idea of this one. Multiple choice is, can you recognize the correct answer? Versus essay is more off the top of your head. Can you generate an answer that makes sense? Quick true false as we continue our review of memory. Short-term memory is related to retroactive interference because the process is often similar. So for example, short-term memory, you're trying to remember somebody's number, you're trying to remember a list of goals or a list of things to get at the grocery store, and then you get distracted. Somebody starts talking to you. What that means is that that old information that you're trying to remember is interfered with retroactively by this new information, this new conversation you're having, and chances are it's bumped out of short-term memory completely and it's lost forever. Unfortunately, this is false. All-nighters certainly hurt your long-term storage, but they also do not help with your test performance the next day. So double whammy, the negative impact of all-nighters on test performance. Knowing how to rollerblade, assuming you've been rollerblading and know how to do it well, this would not be semantic memory, this would be an implicit memory. You could also argue that it could be an explicit memory if you are trying to rollerblade for the first time and have to explicitly be paying attention to how fast should I be going, how should I hold my body position. An example of a semantic memory would be, how is a rollerblade similar to and different from a roller skate? It's important to remember how long short-term memories can last. As we talked about, 30 seconds under normal circumstances. Imagine maybe the optimal circumstances. You are in a small, quiet room with no distractions, and I asked you to remember a paragraph and repeat it for as long as you can. Do you think you'd be able to last an hour? Probably not. Even under the best circumstances, maybe a few minutes short-term memories can last. After that, we start to see interference. We start to think about, what do I want to have for supper tonight? What do I want to do this weekend? And then that older information is pushed out, some of it lost forever. Might seem a little gross, but yes, picturing someone vomiting when you hear the word chunking would be a great example of semantic memory. This is also false. Some of the Hollywoodization of what we know about amnesia and specifically memory. Very rarely do people forget almost everything about their previous life. Although there are some examples, so it is possible, but it is very, very rare. Let's do a quick fill in the blank. This is the brain structure that is key for the explicit pathway, which is the hippocampus. We have two types of amnesia. The most common is the one that we have trouble learning new information. So for example, if you have a grandma with Alzheimer's, she might still have decent memory of things that happened in her childhood or young adulthood, but it is also more difficult for her to remember things that happened recently, what happened yesterday, for example. If you remember, our memory construction person, that is Elizabeth Loftus, very famous in psychology and outside of psychology as well. If it is old interfering with the recall of more recent information, this is forward active or proactive interference. This is true. Episodic and semantic are two kinds of explicit memories. And acronyms would represent this fairly straightforward but very powerful memory technique, the use of chunking. And as we work toward wrapping things up, here is our key study. For those of you who might have seen or at least are familiar with Will Smith's fairly recent movie Concussion, this is the key character, Bennet Omalu, a Pittsburgh physician, and he was presented with the case of a recently deceased Pittsburgh Steeler great who was in his late 30s, early 40s, Mike Webster. He had started to show very wild mood swings, depression, I believe substance abuse, and eventually passed away. The family was very traumatized, and Omalu wanted to do an autopsy on the brain. He had to do a lot of convincing for this autopsy to happen, but he thought that it was important to look at what this brain looked like because these behaviors were abnormal for the person and were also abnormal for people of that age. And what he found was evidence of what's come to be known, although he did not discover it, but it's gained a lot of notoriety, as chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE. And so he found a large pattern of damage throughout much of the brain, especially the cortex. Also these plaques and tangles that are similar to Alzheimer's disease, but found them in many places that maybe you wouldn't see in early and mid stages of Alzheimer's disease. So basically, this brain looked terrible, and there seemed to be a want to understand how this brain got this way. And it's somewhat ironic that the movie based on this character was named Concussion, because chronic traumatic encephalopathy is not just on concussive hits. In fact, it's repeated head trauma, much of which does not register as a concussion. And this story was very interesting to me because basically Omalu and his colleagues put out this study, and it got a lot of notoriety, and the NFL spent a lot of time and effort trying to get this study retracted, basically saying their methods were poor, that the research wasn't good. But the research community stood up to it and stood behind their research, and then this was allowed to stand and more research is being done, and it's led to this brain bank of people in sports that may experience repeated head trauma, such as football and professional wrestling, and not surprisingly, retirees of those sports tend to show increase in risky behaviors, such as domestic abuse, substance abuse, and murder-suicide. And so it seems like there's links to participating in a sport that has repetitive head trauma that doesn't necessarily have to be lots of concussions, and later on very abnormal and dangerous psychological disorders and behaviors. And so the idea behind this is that, do we have a bunch of retired football players, boxers, and wrestlers who are in some ways sort of ticking time bombs for dangerous behavior toward themselves and their families? And this leads to, if so, how can we perhaps diagnose this? And what's exciting is that there's been recent progress to actually diagnose CTE in living patients, because previously you were only limited to being able to diagnose it after death on autopsy. So what this leads potentially is to being able to diagnose in not just professional football players, but also college and high school football players, to really understand the damage or potentially not damage that playing football for a certain length of time can have. So very exciting to see where developments in this continue to go. But that's a wrap for now. Let's discuss what kinds of things did you already know about memory? What kinds of things didn't you know? What kind of things could you use right now to boost your memory performance? What kind of things were you already doing that maybe you just hadn't had terms for? We can also apply this thing in terms of our criminal justice and media environments. What kinds of things do we use to get people's attention and to get them to remember things? And in terms of making decisions, for example, who to vote for, how do we decide whether we want to control, use what we know about memory to regulate and influence what people see? For example, we know that people are very susceptible to lies, and even if somebody knows it's a lie, if they hear that lie repeated over and over again, they're more likely to remember it, and memory construction, they might be more likely to believe it long term. And I think what we've seen recently is that what we know about memory can be used for very bad purposes, whether it's people within our country or outside of our country. And of course, let's talk about a little bit about the brain and how does memory work in the brain. So looking forward to discussing this or any other aspects of memory that you are interested in discussing on the discussion boards.